Today, there are two new opportunities for President Biden to fight off calls for him to drop out of the race. First, you're looking live in Madison, Wisconsin, where President Biden is about to speak at a rally in the key battleground state. Right after, he will be taping a sit-down interview that will air tonight. And while today could be pivotal, there's new evidence that winning the confidence of Democrats could still be a tall order. A Democratic lawmaker in Congress who is privately skeptical that Biden can stay in the race told NBC News, quote, "Every appearance he makes between now and the convention is make or break in terms of the Democratic support for him continuing on as our nominee." NBC News' Mike Memoli is reporting now. Mike Memoli is reporting from Wisconsin there. And also, of course, we have with us Matthew Dow, chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 presidential campaign and a senior MSNBC political contributor. So, Mike, we can hear everything that's going on behind you. So what can we expect to hear from the president?
Well, the president will be taking the stage very shortly here, Yamiche. We're about to hear from Governor Tony Evers here as one of the few final speakers before the president. It's been really interesting, Yamiche, I have to say, listening to some of the comments from other speakers as part of the program who have been fairly honest, at least more honest than a lot of Democrats feel others tied to the campaign have been in the past week, about really just how much of a perilous moment this is for the president. The state party chairman here for the Wisconsin Democratic Party acknowledging right at the beginning of his remarks that it's been a very tough week. As he put it, one person on the debate stage last week needed a lozenge, the other needed a lie detector. He also talked about what he described as the hand-wringing that is going on within the Democratic Party and said what is needed now is rolling up our sleeves, not wringing of the hand. So that speaks to really the challenge for the president as he is about to come out on stage here. The need to really continue to show to Democrats that he is in this race, that he has the fight to continue and the stamina, frankly, to continue in this race as well. And to that point, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, got a number of questions from reporters on Air Force One here on the journey to Madison. And she said, listen, the president understands that being president is a 24/7, 365-day kind of job, and that the president has put the onus on himself to do a better job of balancing his time to make sure that he has the energy moving forward. This is obviously something that has come up during some of his private conversations with governors. And one new comment now coming from the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, who says in a statement that she thinks the president does need to have some moments of introspective now about whether he is still the person who can beat Donald Trump in November.
Yeah. And Matthew, I mean, Mike just took us there, so we're going to go there. This Massachusetts governor is really openly questioning whether or not Biden should continue on here. What do you make of those comments, and what does that say about this current situation?
Well, I think her comments are just reflective of the reality that Joe Biden sits in, and Joe Biden sits in it primarily because of his performance at the debate in this. And I've said all along, we all need to give Joe Biden the grace and space to make the decision, to look at what he needs to look at to decide what's in the best interest of the party, of his party, and more importantly, the country in the course of this. I think these events are important. In the small I importance in for him to sort of reestablish his feet on the ground, but they're only going to impact, these events are not going to impact voters across the country. They're going to impact people that influence the process, big contributors, other people, newspaper editorials in the course of this. And so it's just a small step that won't really affect a broad group of voters that are nervous about this in the course of this. But I think the governor of Massachusetts' statement is just another, underlining of the fact that the lead of the ticket this year is in dire straits about whether or not he's going to be able to do what he needs to do to beat Trump.
Well, Matthew, I want to ask you, do you think that maybe every event, every moment between now and the convention, maybe even now in the election, has a capital I important on it, that it's all make or break because of what happened?
Well, I mean, that's the thing here. The problem with the debate wasn't that he had a bad debate. The problem with the debate was he had a debate that fed the narrative that had long been building about him for the last few years, that voters had begun to believe that he wasn't youthful enough, that he wasn't competent enough to function in the Oval Office and be president of the United States. That was the problem with the debate. How you break that is a whole series of things, one of which is this event, but it has to be 1,000 things. It has to be the interview tonight. It has to be a whole bunch of things that break that. And then ultimately, if he is the nominee, stays in the race, it has to be the next debate in this. The problem for Joe Biden is that anything that doesn't go positively is going to make the job tons harder. So anything that looks like a crack in that series of things that he does, he almost has to go 100% shooting over the course of this until election night and not miss a single shot to show that he is competent and has the energy enough to do the job. That's a tall order.
Yeah, that's a very tall order because no one really shoots 100% of the time. Mike, if I could come back to you, the president is facing calls to ramp up his schedule and make more appearances, but he just told a group of governors, which included that governor of Massachusetts that we were just talking about, that he's going to limit events and even get more sleep, maybe even go and sort of call it a night at 8 p.m. here. Could this July push be backfiring on the president?
I think this is part of the quandary that the Biden campaign is in right now, because as you see from the comments from Karine Jean-Pierre just a few moments ago as well, anything that the president's team does to indicate that, yes, they know that at 81 years old, he needs to balance his time more to take care of himself, as Karine Jean-Pierre put it, only speaks to the fact that maybe an 81-year-old president, somebody who would be 86 by the end of a second term, is something that is not in the best interests of the country. But they also know that there is even some questions within the president's own team about whether it was a smart idea to have him travel, as the president put it, around the world twice in the weeks leading up to his debate, to then spend that time in intense debate prep with his team going into this kind of packed schedule. That in some ways the performative aspect, in ways they're trying to prove the doubters wrong about his age and fitness for office, have only compounded the problem by making the problem even worse. It's a vicious cycle here, and it's one that the campaign has to deal with going forward.
Yeah, and from what we understand, there's more and more applause. So it sounds like maybe we'll be getting the president soon here, if I understand it.
Donald Trump is a dangerous threat to our country.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Yamiche. As we wait for Tony Evers to conclude his remarks, he'll then hand off the microphone to the woman behind him. This is an organizer here in the state that, as we understand it from the Biden campaign, is here to kind of speak to what they hope the focus will be and moving forward, which is not about the president and his fitness for office, but really about the stakes of what's at stake in this election, our democracy, our freedoms. That's really part of what the president is going to be hammering here during his remarks. But again, a big question of whether we'll see, as he did last week, of acknowledging his own poor performance and vowing to the Democrats. This is a room full of activists, it should be noted. We're in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a very much a dark blue dot in a very purple state. And so this is a crowd that wants to be for him, and will give him that energy that he needs as well.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.